That's where it gets really nasty. That is the part of the story that I was completely unprepared for when I asked the question, who are they, John? And at first I couldn't believe it. This story led me, of all places, to Nazi Germany. In my book, World Without Cancer, I've documented, in fact, the whole major portion of the last half of the book is devoted to a documentation of the connection between the Rockefeller financial institutions and this cartel that I mentioned a moment ago called IG Farben. IG, I think, stands for Interessengemeinschaft or something like that. My German is non-existent, but it stands, I've been told, for a community of interest. Is translated into community of interest, Farben. Another way of saying community of interest would be cartel. That would be our word for it. So it's the Farben cartel that we're talking about. And Farben, it was the word that derived from the old, the beginning of the whole chemical industry, which was dyestuffs. It all began with the creation of dyes. And from there it went into industrial chemicals, and from there it went into pharmaceuticals. And that's, of course, where it is today, to say nothing of munitions, which was sort of an offshoot of the whole thing. So you're talking about a tremendously large and financially powerful cartel that originated in Germany, but very quickly partnered with the Rockefeller Group in this country. Let's pick up the story and see how these interests captured control of the American medical establishment. The mechanism that they used to do this was brilliant. They used the tax-exempt foundations. We're talking about the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and people like that. And what they did is they used the tax-exempt foundations, some of which they created themselves, and some of which they took over, which is not too difficult to do if you have a lot of money. And the tactic, as I mentioned, was pioneered by Rockefeller and Carnegie. Let's go into the community, and we'll do something called matching funds. You will put up $1 for every dollar that can be raised by the citizens themselves in the community for this hospital or for this library. He said, now the advantage of that is you get a lot of people working with you, and they view themselves as on your team. And so they're out there raising money, and they're mentioning your name. Every time they raise a buck, they're mentioning your name, and they become your publicity agents in a way. And they have an affinity to you because now they're working with you. And so you have all of these people working for free for you, raising money, and you only put up half the money that you would have ordinarily. So this way you still get your name across the top of the door of the library, but it's only cost you half as much money, and you got all this good publicity besides. That was the Pillsbury formula. Rockefeller saw that, and he hired Gates immediately. He says, you got to come to work for me, and he did. So this fellow Gates was largely the genius behind so much of this strategy. And it's what they called efficiency in philanthropy. That was their phrase for it. How to give away money efficiently, meaning how do you get back money? How do you get back more than what you give away? This has been the stratagem that has been used by so many of these people for many years, and the public has not really been aware of it. It's certainly true in the field of pharmaceutical research. The people that we're talking about, Rockefeller and Carnegie in particular, came to the picture and said, we will put up money. We will solve the problem. And so they hired a fellow by the name of Abraham Flexner. And in 1910, Flexner produced what was called the Flexner Report, which was widely circulated, in which he identified the problems and the weaknesses in American medicine and suggested that the schools of this country be completely made over and the standards be increased and that funding be increased. And this was the solution, money, of course. Then the people who paid for Flexner to do this report offered the money. They offered tremendous amounts of money, to the schools that would agree to cooperate with them. What did they ask? Not very much, really. They had what they called a triumvirate, 3 men primarily. There was Abraham Flexner, his brother, Simon, I think it was Simon Flexner, and Fred Gates. He was the one I mentioned before who was the mastermind behind the strategy. Those 3 men, called the triumvirate, the donors said to the schools, we're giving you all this money. Now, would it be too much to ask if we could put some of our people on your board of directors to see that our money is being spent wisely? Well, when somebody's offering a starving school, a struggling school, a couple of $1 million, and all they ask in return is that some very well-known and prestigious individuals be added to your board of directors, the answer in many cases is yes, we'd be honored to have these people on our board of directors. Almost overnight, all of the major universities, which we now consider to be major universities in the field of medicine, received large grants from these sources and also accepted 1, 2, or 3 of these people that I mentioned on their board of directors, and the schools literally were taken over by the financial interests that put up the money. They were able to upgrade the level of medical education in America by 100-fold. But at the same time as doing that, they skewed the whole thing in the direction of pharmaceutical drugs. That was the efficiency in philanthropy. The doctors from that point forward in history would be taught pharmaceutical drugs. Those schools that did not accept those terms did not receive the money, and they generally fell by the wayside, and today you probably have never heard of them. So, we translate that into the real world of FDA approval. You know, the FDA now requires all of these substances to be used in the treatment of any disease to go through a rigorous testing process. We have all heard that. I have forgotten the number. It goes up every month. I guess it's $20 million or more, maybe much more, for the average drug to get processed and tested, and they test it for efficiency, efficacy, and safety. Well, who is going to spend $20 million testing the safety and efficacy of an apricot seed? You can't patent it. It's just money down the drain. Surely these drug companies aren't going to spend $20 million or more testing any substance from nature because it can't be patented. That, and of course the FDA says it's illegal to use unless it's been tested for efficacy and safety. Now you see the catch-22 you're in there. Nothing from nature, regardless of how effective it might be, will ever be proven safe or effective according to the FDA. It'll never be. Because nobody's going to spend the money to go through the test. So therefore, everything from nature will always be condemned by the FDA as unproven. An unproven cancer cure, which is the label they tried to hang on Laetrile. It was indeed unproven in terms of FDA testing, but it was very well proven in the clinics and in the hospitals and in the laboratories of the people who were using it with a serious intent. I've given you a few names, just a few of them. They're all over the place. Now, let me hasten to point out that this does not necessarily mean, in fact, it does not mean at all, that most of these, or even many of these people, are conspirators who are trying to keep a control for cancer away from mankind. It's the profit motive, ladies and gentlemen. It's not that they're trying to kill people, literally. They are killing people, but that's not their motive. Their motive is to make a buck. Their motive is to ignore anything that's competition to making a buck. And in that process of ignoring something from nature, it's causing unimaginable human suffering and death. We know that they're not doing this consciously because they themselves are victims. They fall to cancer and their families fall to cancer just like everyone else. So obviously if they knew or felt that this was an effective treatment, they would be using it, and they're not. In fact, the average doctor has a higher cancer rate than anybody else, any other occupation you can imagine, except possibly somebody working constantly around X-ray equipment. So we know that this is not a conspiracy to kill people. It does mean that vested interests have captured our medical system and caused it to be biased in favor of drugs. It does mean that the bias has been written into our laws and now prevents you and me from having freedom of choice to seek alternative cancer therapies. It does mean that those who have done this are also victims of their own bias, and it most assuredly means that we had better do something about it.